Hey, good morning. Thanks for all coming. It's a great honor to be here at Chatham House today, as Lena mentioned, on the 8th anniversary, 15th of March, talking about something very important, the future of Syria. And I think by the end of this panel, you'll agree that the future of Syria is in good hands with the kind of speakers that we're going to hear from today, who have a lot of very, very interesting and important things to say. A couple of little housekeeping things before we get started. This is on the record and open to the media. It's live streamed and you can tweet. So just be aware of that when you're asking your questions, but also feel free to share the discussions that we are having. You can use the hashtag CHSyria. So it's CHSyria, Chatham House Syria. And also, if there's a fire alarm, evacuate. So without further ado, basically, we're going to have a short discussion, as usual. We've all done this before, and then a Q&A from the audience, and so we'll get to the housekeeping around the Q&A at that time. But firstly, I'll introduce my very excellent panel that I'm excited to get into a discussion with. So from my left, Haid is a Syrian columnist and consulting research fellow with the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program. He's a research fellow at the ICSR at King's College. Previously, he was a program manager on Syria and Iraq at Henrik Böll in Beirut, and he has also worked as a senior community services protection assistant at UNHCR Damascus. He has a BA in sociology, a postgrad diploma in counseling, an MA in social development, and is completing a PhD as well. So along from Haid is Basma. Basma Alouche is the Advocacy and Communications Officer at the Norwegian Refugee Council in the USA, covering the Middle East, West Africa, and Afghanistan. She is an independent researcher who looks at human security issues in Syria. She has obtained a master's degree at the Fletcher School, where she focused on transitional justice, human security, and conflict resolution. Sinan is to her left. He's a senior associate fellow at the Al-Shaq Forum in Omran Center for Strategic Studies in Istanbul. His research is focused on governance and local councils, anti-radicalization, Islamism, and Kurdish political movement, and the new regional order in the Middle East. Prior to that, he was the executive director of the Syrian National Coalition Media Office. So we're going to hear a little bit today about Sinan's new paper, which you can find in your packet. You'll get a preview of some of the topics that are in this paper during the discussion that we're about to have, but I recommend that you all read it. It's very good. So, to the discussion. I think over the next sort of 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to start with the macro, work our way down to the micro, and then we will move on to questions and answers. So we are looking predominantly today at the conflict economy and the dynamics around that. We've all heard a lot about the war economy, the impact on the economy shrinking because of the conflict. We're going to look at all sorts of different aspects of what that means for local actors, for international actors, and of course for people on the ground who are impacted by those changes to the economy. So Basma, do you think you could perhaps kick us off just by setting the scene a little bit and giving us a sort of a quick top-line overview of the impact the conflict has had on the economy inside of Syria?
Absolutely, and thanks, Emma, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here and listening to me. So just to start off with and paint like a very general overview of the economy in Syria, I mean, the conflict has really impacted it in various ways, and just to kind of bring it or paint a picture for you, you obviously have the destruction of physical capital, you have the casualties that resulted directly because of the conflict, you have the forced migration that was really driven by the conflict and had a serious impact on the economy. And to just kind of put it in numbers a little bit, Syria's GDP between 2011 to 2015, according to the World Bank, contracted by 61%. And they stopped counting at 2015. I mean, so we can only imagine in the past 3 years the impact there as well. You have key sectors that just briefly composed or comprised the overall economy. And those included tourism, that was about 14% of the overall economy and created multiple jobs. I think it's safe to say, aside from like the small religious pilgrimages that happen to areas around Damascus, that sector is almost completely gone. You have the oil and gas that was impacted by the destruction of infrastructure, but also by external factors as well, like sanctions and things like that. The oil GDP declined by 93%, and then non-oil GDP by 52%. So I mean, we're talking about huge, huge numbers. You have agriculture that declined by 41%, and it basically constituted about 20 to 40% of employment of the workforce population. So those are huge jobs that were lost because of this contraction. There's also the manufacturing industry, where manufacturing hubs like Aleppo were destroyed, where physical infrastructure was destroyed. You had a lot of manufacturers themselves move to neighboring areas, which means that's the revenue lost for the country. And then you have a lot of looting and damage to equipment and things that typically come with conflict as well, but have a direct impact on the economy. Outside of these sectors specifically, you also had a consequence of the conflict, a decrease in foreign direct investment, and also a decrease in consumption internally. And then you also had decreased government spending. So I mean, you're constant, like all different injections into the economy that typically help boost and a healthy economy have all contracted, leaving populations to really fend for themselves. And you also had the external impact of the sanctions and their consequent impact on banking sectors and the high unemployment that kind of resulted because of that. So I think just to throw a bunch of stuff at you in the first part, I think that's just the overall grim picture that we're really looking at, and happy to dive deeper in a bit.
Excellent, thank you. And so Sinan, you've looked at the economy obviously in your paper, and particularly at how sort of the external actors who are supporting the government of Syria are engaging with that economy. So do you think you could talk us through a little bit how sort of Russia and Iran in particular are engaging with economic issues in Syria, and sort of what economic benefits that they're seeking through that engagement?
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Chatham House, for inviting me once again. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be here. What triggered the research presented in the paper is two perceptions that are widely dominating the political debate over Syria right now. The first one is that the regime has won the war and that the next phase is reconstructing the economy. The second perception or idea is that Russia, to a large degree, has the capacity and the willingness to counter Iran in Syria. And it seems that this is particularly a very attractive idea in the Arab countries. So, however, looking up close at the situation, we can witness that the reality is always much more complex. So it is true that the Iranian and the Russian intervention in the civil war was very important for the regime to overcome the opposition. It has allowed it to first keep control over the major cities, and in later stage to push out the opposition from very important enclaves around Damascus and southern Syria. And now most of the opposition are in the north, in Idlib in particular, and northern Aleppo, and also counting the SDF territories in northeastern Syria. But from there, it is natural to assume and to expect that the Russians and the Iranians are best placed to reap the benefits of the next stage, having presented and provided resources, financial, human, and even equipment. Both are well placed to benefit from the next stage. However, once again, the reality is much more complex. The Syrian economy is in shatter, and in order to be able to reap benefits, you need to invest a lot of money in the infrastructure, a lot of money in the different sectors of the economy, which is something that neither is very enthusiastic, first of all, and also do not necessarily have the means to invest. So we have Russians that are not particularly interested in investing a lot of money in the Syrian economy. They're looking at investing in certain sectors, especially in the oil and gas, and maybe in energy. And this is because it's a very quick return of investment. But when it comes to rebuilding the infrastructure, rebuilding the manufacturing infrastructure, we haven't seen a lot of interest picked up by Moscow. When it comes to Iran, the situation is a little bit different. Iran is under heavy sanctions from the US, is on its own going through a lot of difficulties on domestic level, and doesn't have lots of equity to spare in Syria in the first place. Nevertheless, both adopt a very opportunistic approach when it comes to the economy in Syria. So they look at two types of projects. Projects that have quick and high return of investment, and projects that enable them to control the economy and hence control the regime. But in this approach, looking from this point of view, they both adopt different strategies. So we have the Russians that are more or less adopting a top-to-bottom approach, so helping and assisting the regime to reconsolidate its authority over the Syrian territory and also the Syrian economy. Whereas the Iranians adopt a hybrid model. So they do help the regime in certain cases, but at the same time invest a lot in local communities that are loyal to the Iranians and the IRGC. So we've seen a surge of investments, for example, in the city of Aleppo, where they have the network of local defense forces. We have seen also some investment in eastern Syria, in Bukamal, in the resort. Not a whole lot, but enough to infiltrate and to be able to win the hearts and minds of the local populations. And similar investments also around Damascus, especially in the southern suburbs in Sid Zainab and so on and so forth. And I would just add one idea before passing, the mic, is if another major difference between the two countries is that Russia encouraged international investment in Syria and have demanded in many cases not only the European countries to invest, but also the GCC countries and so on and so forth. However, this is conditioned by not challenging the Assad authority in any way. So it should be unconditional investment, unconditional donations to the Syrian economy, which is something that definitely the EU and the US are against. On the other hand, Iran is much more let's say sensitive to this question. They view that such investment could lead eventually to curbing their interest in the country.
Okay, and you spoke about them sort of trying to control Assad to some extent through this kind of economic activity. Can you talk a little bit about the Assad or the government of Syria's role within this, and whether they have agency or the agency is sort of being projected on them from other actors?
Yeah, so this is also another idea that more or less dominates the debates, that the Syrian regime is completely dependent on the Iranian and Russian support, and hence is very weak and cannot exercise any kind of agencies in Syria. But this reality is changing, and with passing time, the regime is able to reconsolidate its authority over certain areas, of certain sectors of the economy. Now, it is not yet, it hasn't reached, and it's very far from reaching an area where it exercises full sovereignty over the country. Let's be clear on this. However, that doesn't prevent the regime from playing one against the other. So, for example, there's a very telling example, which is the phosphate mining contracts. Initially, it was there have been an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, signed in 17 in January in Tehran, to give mining rights to the Iranian government. Just a few months after, in June 2017, the contracts have been, the MOU hasn't been concretized into a contract, and moreover, the contract has been attributed to Straskoin Gas, which is a Russian company, and has won 50 years rights to mine the phosphate in Tadmor, with only 30% of the revenues to the regime. So we see here a very telling example of promising something to the Iranians and then giving it to the Russians. And we have also counter examples where contracts have been initially negotiated with the Russians and then stopped, withheld, and given to the Iranians.
And perhaps, Hyde, you could pick up on what we've been talking about here with regard to the Syrian government and the economy, and sort of talk a little bit about the impact that the economic situation and these other actors is having on the conflict dynamics and the ability of the government to maintain state functions or to rebuild state institutions and their functionality.
Sure. I think for many Syrians, when you talk to them, despite whether they like the regime and the government and whether they consider them legitimate or not, those who live under the regime control right now, they want or expect at least two main services or functions from the state. One is related to security and protection, and the other one is related to service provision. When it comes to the first one, the security and protection, it's clear that the regime has been able to recapture, let's say, up to between 60 and 65% of the country now. And that, in a sense, says that the regime has more territorial control inside Syria. But when you look at basically what does that really mean in different areas, because the situation is not the same everywhere, you will be able to see a few things. I will mention a few remarks here, and maybe we can discuss them during the discussion later on. One clear issue is, for example, that the regime doesn't have unlimited access to all areas under its control, and that is mainly because of the deals that were brokered between Russia and some of local actors directly. For example, in Dar'a and Busra Sham, there was a deal between Ahmed al-Aoudi, who was one of the rebel leaders there, and Russians, and the deal basically prevents, in a way, the regime from entering that area. I mean, by the regime, I mean military/security forces. Nonetheless, the regime and those security forces have the ability to establish checkpoints around the area and the entrances of those areas. This is just one issue to highlight that basically, despite the fact that the regime has basically expanded its territorial control, we are not able to see its ability to access all areas. And this is not a bad thing. It's good for many of those people who are still basically don't trust the regime. The other issue is related basically to the fact that the regime doesn't have enough financial resources in order to pay all the people, whether they are part of the militias that are linked to and backed by Iran, or the other structures that were created by Russia, or the former rebel groups that are now being co-opted into the system again. And this is, in a way, impacting the ability of the state on two different levels. The first one is that despite the fact that we now started hearing about the reintegration process of those people, what some people refer to as DDR, which is the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. When you look at what's really happening, it's completely different, because the regime is not the main actor leading this. It's one of the actors. You have Iran and Russia who are doing that. And when it comes to really what's happening in details, you see that most of those people are being reintegrated or co-opted by parallel structures, not the regular institutions, like the Faylaq al-Khamis, al-Fuq al-Raba, and local defense forces and others. So this means that despite the fact that those groups and individuals are in more unified structures, they still are not part of the regular forces, and they're funded and directly commanded by foreign actors. And that has many complications we can discuss later on. The last bit I want to talk about here is that the inability of the state to prevent basically the use of physical force. And that has improved. We cannot deny that, but still, the state, especially in regime-controlled areas, for example, in Eastern Aleppo and other areas, still is not able to prevent, first, the infighting between different groups that are allied with the regime, which is, for example, what happened recently in rural Hama, where Al-Furqa Raba, the 4th Division, and the Tiger forces, they started clashing. Similar things happened in Deir ez-Zor. This is one thing. The other thing is that the violations committed by those militias against civilians, and mainly when we talk about that, we talk about Eastern Aleppo. So those, in general, are when it comes to security and protection. So the regime, in conclusion, regarding this bit, is that the state and the regime has been able to basically increase its control, but that is still far from basically being able to ensure the protection and stability in those areas. We can talk about the services and others now if you want, or we can talk about it later.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the services, just with regard to their ability in those circumstances to provide basic sort of state functions like basic services, and the relationship that they're having to have with other actors in order to do that, be it Iran and Russia, be it humanitarian agencies, be it the sort of major businessmen or other sort of economic actors that are operating there. So can you talk us through how that's operating?
Sure. So when we talk about basically service provision, I think it's important to highlight that there are broadly two main categories. So the first category is includes the areas that remain under the control of the regime throughout the conflict. And here we talk about central Damascus, Tartus, and Latakia coastal areas, among others. And in those areas, basically the scale of destruction is limited, and because many of the state institutions remained basically active throughout the conflict, the main challenge that is facing the state right now in those areas is to be able to provide quality services. Mm-hmm. And some of those services have improved. For example, when we talk about electricity and water, it has improved if you compare it to what the situation was like 2 years ago. But at the same time, there are many services that the state is struggling with. The main obvious one is what basically the shortage that we have been seeing in Syria recently with regard to fuel and cooking gas. And the president, like Assad himself, he mentioned that in his latest speech last month, when he said that the government is still unable to basically fulfill those duties and provide quality services. And that, for sure, has implications on the people who are living there, who are publicly now criticizing the government, not the regime. One, it's important to differentiate between the two issues, because those sort of like, this sort of like criticism is related to service provision and stuff like that, not related to political aspects. So this is why I'm differentiating between the regime and the state functions and institutions. When it comes to basically the other category, which is areas, the former rebel controlled areas, let's put it this way. Here, the ability of the state to provide services depends mainly on two factors. The first one is the level of destruction in those areas. Some areas were mostly destroyed. Others, the level of destruction is quite limited in a way. And this is only relevant because the regime and the state, as Sina mentioned, and other actors are not really invested in rebuilding the infrastructure. So what they're trying to do here is to look for quick fixes. For example, when it comes to electricity, if that infrastructure is not destroyed, then what they can do is just to connect it and provide them for like 1 or 2 hours of electricity a day, while in many other areas where the infrastructure is completely destroyed, they cannot do much. So they're not doing much. For example, when it comes to health services, there are only few hospitals that are still functioning in Daraa. and the pressure is just overwhelming on those hospitals, because first of all the field hospitals and clinics that used to exist before were shut down by the regime. They are not allowed to operate. Second, because most of the hospitals were attacked by the regime and the Russians before. So this is why you have two issues here. And the second important factor here is basically related to the perceived loyalty of those areas. Although most of the people, they say like former rebel control areas are in a way the same to the regime, but not exactly, because some areas agreed to surrender quicker than others. And this is why the regime is still using services as a way to punish those people and reward others. So this is why I think when we talk about the ability of the state to provide services, I think we should keep in mind that this tool is still being used as a way to reward some and punish others. So this is in general. When we come quickly on the actors, as a result of that, basically you have one issue is that the government and the regime are trying to outsource some of those services to other actors. For example, they now depend quite heavily, not only now, but now because most of the former rebel-controlled areas are under the regime of the control of the regime, that increases the responsibility of the regime, at least theoretically, to provide services there. So now they increase their dependence on humanitarian actors has increased. And I think here it's important to talk about the way aid is being distributed in those areas, because the regime is still able to determine where aid is distributed, to who, when, and where. So I mentioned that. So we can talk about that in a bit maybe or later during the discussion, but this is one of the issues I think that is important to address, because it's one of the issues that we might be able to change a bit. And the other thing is that this is allowing private businessmen and regime cronies in order to benefit from those issues. For example, when it comes to electricity and water, many of them now trying to establish their own businesses and mobilize the market when it comes to providing generators and water tanks to areas. So that might, at a later stage, not now, limit even the ability of the state to provide services in those areas, because those people don't want that to happen. But we are not talking about that right now. That might be a discussion or a problem we might be facing in the future.
And Sananda, do you want to expand at all on how Iran and Russia are engaging with service provision?
Well, I think what is important to underline here is, even though the regime allows this kind of parallel, let's say, service provision to happen, it also has manifested a certain capacity to prioritize its concerns. So right now, the first priority is definitely security provision. And we've seen in many cases in where previously the regime delegated service provision to certain, for example, ex-rebel groups, or even some of the loyalist militias, to then return and retrieve this delegation from them. We've seen this with Liwa al-Awwal in Barzeh. We've seen this also with Ayman al-Jabir, for example, militia Suqur al-Sahra. And there have been some efforts to reconsolidate, and every now and then we hear that some new groups have been reintegrated within the 5th Corps. So what I wanted to highlight here is, even though it doesn't necessarily happen in a very quick pace and as much as the regime wants, but since it's unchallenged and the Russians are greatly helping the regime in this context, a little bit less Iranians, it's just a matter of time before the regime is able to contract and to consolidate the security aspect. The financial issue is a very important one, is not one to be overseen. But at the same time, what the regime is allowing is parallel economy structure, so illicit trafficking and also smuggling. And we've seen this especially around Idlib, for example, where supposedly there is a front line and there is battles ongoing, but there's a lot of cross frontline trade happening. So and this is, for example, one explanation for the triple-size volume of Turkish goods exported to Syria in comparison to before the revolution 2011, because the Syrian population in Idlib have been importing it and then smuggling it out to the rest of Syria. And this happens in cooperation and in collaborations with similar networks from the loyalist parts. And it's very interesting because when we look at this map, we see the emergence of new trade hubs that didn't used to exist before. So we have Al-Bab, for example. There used to be a very important hub during the ISIS phase because it was the main city from which the oil products used to be sold to the regime and the opposition. Bukamal used to be also emerged as a very important trade hub during ISIS. Now, this is not the case anymore, but if we look at Idlib, or the extended Idlib region, so we have Ma'arat al-Nu'man that have boomed in terms of trades. We have Qal'at al-Madiq also, who boomed in the same way. It's all very small cities. And they have even the smaller towns that are now considered a very important trade hub, like Harim, like also other cities near the borders with Turkey. So what I wanted to highlight is that even though the regime either tolerates or allows, it really depends on how we look at this. It is being able to control this one way or another, and is able to orchestrate the different actors. And I think we should be very careful not to underestimate its capacity.
Quickly, just to clarify, I was not basically estimating that, but I was looking closer to those dynamics because, as I mentioned earlier, they are like, clearly the regime has been able to extend its territorial control. But when you look closer and you look at the dynamics within the regime camp, let's mention, and here again, when the role that Iran is playing in particular when it comes to the local defense forces and others, they are trying to basically establish whether they will succeed or not. That's a different story. They're trying to establish structures, parallel structures that will allow them to maintain influence through maybe even armed groups and non-state actors. Maybe there will be semi-state actors, but those are dynamics that do exist as well.
So I think we might come back to sort of the informal column and these sort of networks and how they're operating. But I want to make sure that we do have time before we get to questions to talk about the impact for people on the ground. So how does all of this kind of geopolitical and various actors working together, how does that manifest for people who are trying to live day to day? And so if we jump from services to a particular sector, which has a sort of a cross-cutting impact on local economic activity, which would be agriculture. Do you want to talk us through, Basma, a little bit about the impact that all of this is having on the agricultural sector and the people that work within it?
Sure. So I mean, the agriculture sector, as I mentioned in the start of this panel, employed about 20 to 40% of the Syrian workforce population in 2006. And it basically constituted about a fifth of the overall GDP. It's an interesting sector to look at because it was reeling from a few problems, or a substantial set of problems before the conflict, and that was only exacerbated with the conflict and the violence that ensued in 2011. So around 2000, towards the end of 2016, FAO estimated that the agriculture sector experienced about $16 billion in losses. And I suspect that would be a lot higher today. Historically, the sector, there was a lot of mismanagement by the government of this, of the resources that went into, the agriculture sector and the inputs that it provided. So you had a lot of water mismanagement resources. You had a lot of subsidies that the government provided in terms of fuel and things like in local inputs. The government was really pushing for Syria to be a more self-sufficient producer and kind of not relying on other states or other countries or external actors to really try to sustain itself and to feed its population, and also use agriculture as a cash crop, for cash crop productions. You had the state being the main buyer, so it bought about 80% of the produce that was produced of wheat, for instance, and it also set the prices. So you really had this very close connection between the farming community and the state itself. In 2006, there were a few hits that changed some of this policy, which was severe droughts that really impacted the Northeast and other areas around Syria, which caused the government to realize that there has been some mismanagement. So the reaction was, let's just remove a lot of these subsidies that were provided. And it made the cost of pumping water, for instance, very, very, very difficult and very high for the average farmer that just could no longer afford these inputs or these costs. And it created this huge influx of migration from rural areas to urban centers. And as a result of that, these migrants or these farmers that left their rural areas came with a skill set that wasn't necessarily applied or applicable in the urban settings. So you had a lot of farmers that just couldn't meet the skills required to go into different job markets, which contributed to the really high unemployment. And with the conflict in 2011, you started seeing direct impacts on this sector specifically, which kind of perpetuated the problems that they had already been experiencing. So you had the input supplies like seeds, tools, things that are needed to fulfill the farming needs became really, really expensive, and a lot of them became really damaged because of the violence. So you had the destruction of the physical infrastructure, but destruction of supplies and tools as well. You also had a disruption in the supply chain networks. So even just purchasing specific inputs became really, really difficult. You added to that, you had the depletion of the water and fuel reserves, or the depleting reserves that made these resources also unattainable by local farmers. And you had, the added the additional complexity of climate change that is still an issue that I think we're still reeling from in Syria with the failed rains that occurred throughout the past 8 years. Now, the agriculture sector, as I mentioned, is overall contracted by 41%, but this was in 2015. I think for now it's safe to assume that it's contracted by a lot more. The government stopped being the largest buyer, leaving these farmers to really having to shift their approach because they lost their biggest supplier or biggest buyer. And with the prices going up, they no longer were able to sustain the production. So for those that actually ended up remaining in the country, because many, many fled, especially that farming areas were essentially battlegrounds as well throughout the conflict. So for those that remained in the country, they really moved from agriculture being a market to generate income for these farming families and communities to becoming just self-sustaining and just having enough of the input, enough of the costs to kind of consume these costs or absorb these costs only to produce the minimum amount of food needed to sustain themselves. And that's the biggest shift that you're seeing in the agriculture sector in Syria today, is that because of varying issues and varying changes throughout the conflict, you're really seeing an economic loss from the revenues and the profits that this sector used to generate to just becoming a self-sustaining, feeding your family whatever you can, and trying to kind of live through it as a small-knit community or a small-knit family, as opposed to trying to benefit the overall economy.
And what are some of the coping strategies, in addition to just that self-sustaining production, that those agriculturalists are using, and also the people in their broader communities? So what are we seeing as day-to-day ways to get around sort of this massive retraction in the economy that's causing people to suffer?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, according to the 2019 Humanitarian Needs Overview produced by UN OCHA, you're talking about 12 million people that are still in need inside Syria of humanitarian assistance, and 5 million of those are in acute need. I mean, after 8 years of conflict, I think it's safe to say that the resilience capacity of individuals and families has severely eroded, which makes any small economic hit on the family that much more bigger in magnitude and in impact. You have about 83% of Syrians living in below poverty line inside Syria, and about 8.7 million specifically that are in need of livelihood support but have no access to jobs. And that's one of the main points that I want to highlight, is that it's not, there are some jobs available in Syria and there are some livelihood opportunities, albeit much lower than previously or prior to the conflict, but access is a huge issue. You're seeing a lot of populations that were under besiegement, that were going through different restrictions because of the conflict, that were no longer able to access any livelihood opportunities. And I think that's something that we really need to focus on. But for those that were able to access jobs or opportunities, we're seeing a lot that we're relying on local, like the daily labor or waged labor, whatever opportunities they can get for that day, whether it's in construction or trying to, help demolish a building for whatever reason. You also had a lot of petty trading. We're seeing that as a form of income, cited as a form of income. There's the livestock products, selling of the produce that are the products that are created from livestock, or selling livestock itself. And you have a lot of ad hoc, random ways of generating income, or sustaining yourself, like remittances, relying on remittances from family members that are abroad. You have gifts, like monetary and financial gifts that are given from different community members or family members. You see around neighboring people, like Syrians and neighboring or along the borders, you're hearing a lot of crossing borders to buy phone SIM cards and bringing it back in. You saw that a lot in areas around Dar'a, where they go to Jordan, do that, or Turkey in the north, and Israel as well. So you're seeing a lot of areas like Quneitra, you have Syrians that cross borders, buy SIM cards and come back. And all of it is part of the smuggling networks that Sinan was talking about. And then to some of the positive things, I guess, that came out of the conflict is it created a lot of conflict-related jobs. So you see journalism. That's something that, a lot of Syrians are now are becoming more skilled and more equipped and trained in journalistic, in the journalism field. And that's something that directly resulted from the conflict, where you had a lot of NGOs kind of flood in money and try to provide training programs and things like that. But I mean, it's definitely not a rosy picture, and there are a lot of mechanisms or coping mechanisms that have negative consequences that are also being adapted that personally, I mean, in my line of work, I don't see a lot of it highlighted as much as it should be. And I just wanted to kind of list a few things just so we know that this is actually the reality that I'm sure all of you do know, that Syrians are grappling with. And it's things like having to turn to crime, to looting, to joining armed groups for income. You have the depleted savings accounts and depleted assets. So families are holding back children from going to schools because they are putting them in the workforce. So you're seeing a younger workforce going in. You're seeing a lot of smuggling of goods from neighboring countries, but also of people. That's become like a thriving business, so to speak. You're seeing people decrease the number of meals they eat so they can afford food. You're also seeing a lot of people that are choosing to not pursue or not seek any medical assistance and not spend the cost of transportation it takes to get to medical facilities so that they can save that food to feed their families. And just the general, accumulation of debt. You're seeing a rising number of child marriages as a form of protection, but also as a form of, decreasing the expenses in the household. And I mean, lastly but not least, of course, you're seeing a lot of, a lot of sex work. You're seeing women and people selling their bodies. You're also seeing a lot of selling of organs. And that's something that's becoming a bit more widespread now in Syria. And in terms of the response, and some of the NGOs have really been trying to flood money into looking at livelihood opportunities and creating these opportunities, but they've mainly just focused on the agriculture sector and either providing the input products that I was mentioning, like seeds, like particular tools to alleviate some of the costs on farmers. But you also are seeing some livelihood programs in terms of vocational training. So trying to identify the youth that have been outside of the formal sector for 2 or 3 years that need some form of, that need skills to put them into the formal job market. So you're seeing some of that, that programming. But at the same time, I mean, the capacity and the scope is nowhere near enough. Donors are very focused on emergency assistance, which is obviously understandable, but there is this missing link of looking at early recovery stages, looking at building individual resilience and community-based resilience that is no longer almost existent right now. And NGOs are really still relying on in-kind assistance as opposed to really ramping up the programs of creating livelihood opportunities and skill sets needed there.
Thanks, Elsa. I think I'll come back to the humanitarian aspect, but what I wanted to do first was just to get a round of questions from the audience, and so we've had a sort of an overview of lots of different aspects of the economic picture, from the macro down to the micro, and I just wanted to do a round of questions first before we jump back into another sort of small discussion here to engage the audience in questions. So we have a microphone. If you can state your name and your affiliation, and then if we can keep questions reasonably short, that would be appreciated. Yeah.
Hi, Grace Atkinson here from JSO. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. At JSO, we believe that we invest in entrepreneurs through training them in Jordan, Lebanon, and the surrounding countries, mainly Syrian entrepreneurs, because we truly believe that the entrepreneurs, the Syrian youth, can have a massive effect on the future of the business sector and the economy. My question for the panel would be, how do you see the role of entrepreneurship, and especially Syrian youth entrepreneurs, in the future of Syria? And what are some challenges and recommendations that you would highlight? Thank you.
Great, thanks. And so we'll grab 2 or 3 questions and then get the panel to respond to all of them. So behind there.
We've seen a massive expansion within the Kurdish sort of influence in Syria and Iraq, especially. I was just wondering what would your sort of perceptions or predictions be within the regime, especially, and how they're going to sort of respond to that growing influence, and if that would present any sort of economic challenges or maybe opportunities for both sides with it going the sort of peace process. Sorry, my name's Alexander Wardlaw. I'm in the MOD.
Okay, great. And one more over here.
My name is Malad Al-Zabi. I'm a Syrian journalist. My question is for Hayed. As you talked about ongoing failure by the state to provide, even in areas that the state used to control since 2011, do you think we will witness, maybe not in the near future, in a longer term, changes concerning the situation of the population there? Are they going to start protesting against the regime? We started to witness things, especially in social media, criticizing even the regime, not the government, as you made this differentiation. Sometimes we witness people even talked about Bashar al-Assad himself. Do you think in the near future, or maybe in a longer term, we will witness changes in that? Thank you.
Do you want to take the one directed to you first, and then we'll
get the panel to cover the other one. So just to sort of summarize, there was one question about the role of entrepreneurship in the future of Syria, particularly youth entrepreneurship, looking at how the expanded role of the Kurds will shake out in the future, and then a question about the relationship to the regime.
Sure. Personally, I don't really think that might basically amount to any sort of like public arrest against the regime and any kind of like political demand to change the way things are being run in regime-controlled areas. I agree that maybe some mentioned the name of the Assad, but I think most of them, they mentioned the name as a way to protect themselves. So they always start with Siyadat al-Ra'is, and then they say whatever they want to say. But by just addressing the president, that means that we are loyal and we are not criticizing you. We are basically appealing to you in order to help us sort out that problem. And I'm sure it's not your fault as a president. I'm sure it's someone else's fault. And this is why we are addressing it to you in order to help us with that. And I think that will not change, at least in the near future in those areas, because there's no willingness from those people to start something. They know that no one else is interested in supporting them, meaning that the international community has been pushing in a way or another for political transition, despite basically the vague meaning of what that, the vague basically details of what that really amounts to. But they know that many countries, they have said it publicly, that Assad regime will stay. And whether we will start dealing with Assad or not, that will not change the fact that he's staying. And I think people will keep that in mind. That said, we are seeing basically increased level of resistance in former rebel-controlled areas that are now under the control of the regime. So when you look at some areas in Daraa, for example, there was two levels of sort of like resistance. The peaceful one, that when it comes to slogans, they're either criticizing the regime or some other actors, they call them traitors, or demonstrations that took place, especially after the regime tried last week to reinstall this that statue of his father there in that area, but also the basically number of assassination attacks against some of the locals who basically joined the regime. On top of that, the checkpoints and other armed forces that are fighting alongside the regime. So we are seeing something happening in former rebel-controlled areas. In regime-controlled areas, we're seeing some sort of resentment, but that resentment, I tend to believe that it's related to services, not political, because they know that on the political side, they will not be able to get much, and they're scared of the consequences for sure.
I think just briefly on the entrepreneurship question, or youth entrepreneurs, I think there's definitely going to be a need for such skill sets in the future. But I think it also is going to depend on the political economy of Syria and what's going to happen post-conflict, or in the future when they would be willing to return. I think the political structures and also the predictability of business processes and how to registering businesses, knowing that if you're a successful business, you're not going to have to buy into crony networks. I think that's something that we're going to have to think about in the future. But I think in the small scale entrepreneurship opportunities or businesses, I think it's safe to say Syrians are, entrepreneurial in many areas that they end up in. So I think in terms of the skill sets that they're going to face or they're going to need, I think some of it might be inherited, and some of it is obviously refined from training programs like the ones you provide. But I think the challenges are really going to depend on the political economy and the political structures that are going to be available inside the country for when they do return.
Yeah, I'm going to also touch a little bit for the Syrian entrepreneurship question. So first of all, I would like to, to highlight the excellent work that is done by Jusuris. I think is one of the few organizations that is looking into this. But looking beyond that, so I think we need to make a very clear distinction between startups and SMEs, small and medium enterprises. Most of the intervention in this particular sectors are directed to SMEs, not to startups. For startups to work in Syria, there is definitely the political economy question, but there is also the access to technology, the internet infrastructure, as well as the human resources. Most of the well-qualified engineers, maybe most but at least a large portion has left the country, are working in neighboring countries or in Europe, especially when it comes to computer scientists and software engineers. It is definitely a high demanded skills across the world. So this were among the first who left the country. The second problem is also some of the dynamics that we're witnessing. We haven't spoken of it enough previously, which is the new businessmen that are emerging. So the people that are now, I wouldn't say replacing, but they are not the Rami Makhloufs anymore of the previous areas. So there is the Qatarji family, there is also the Foz, the Tarazi, and so on and so forth, of new businessmen coming up to the surface. And these are engaged into monopolizing the Syrian economy. So we're seeing investment across the board, especially in high returned services, so in banking, in telecommunication, also in construction, and so on and so forth. So generally, the economic environment in Syria is not very encouraging for startups, and even less for SMEs, because SMEs cannot simply compete with this. And most importantly, they are extremely impacted by sanctions. So sanctions, we have two types of sanctions. Maybe we can speak of this a little bit more in detail later on. So we have the sanctions on Syrian individuals, including the Foz and the likes, which is fine and is very good. But we have also the sanctions on sectorial sector of economies, and this have impacted a lot the SMEs, because they are not able to import any of their basic, for example, raw materials. They are not being able to export easily. They are not being able to also to do banking transfers and so on and so forth. Whereas the big fishes, in between quotes, are able to override this and being able to find alternative ways. Most of the SMEs that I know running in Syria right now, including industrial, are really struggling to keep on their businesses. Most of them have just enough revenues to pay up for their salaries with no extra income to expand or even maintain their businesses. So this is just something I wanted to highlight. The very important and also interesting question about the Kurdish is the expansion in northern eastern Syria. Looking at the economy, let's say management in Syria, so there is more or less a clear pattern that we're observing in the regime-held areas. Not so much in the opposition-held areas. It's much more decentralized, much more chaotic when it comes to economy and livelihoods. And the SDF is, to a large degree, centralized. So we have the Syrian Democratic Council that is overseeing how the economy is run on the local level. They have also some of the revenues coming from Rumelan oil fields. Not so much, but still, some is being sold. And there is also the flow of funds coming through the IC, the Americans, to a certain degree also the UK, and recently the GCC as well, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Nonetheless, the economy is not also a very rosy picture there. So it is a region that has been hit very hard by drought in 2009 and before. So Khabur Valley is completely depleted. We don't have, the region is a shadow of itself when it comes to wheat production and also cotton production, which used to be the biggest producer in Syria beforehand. And most of the livestock, because also a lot of livestock there, have been smuggled either to Turkey or to the KRG. KRG, one of the most importers of the Syrian livestock, actually. Samalka is the only working cross borders with the outside world, so it's not really going very well. I think that the regime, if the circumstances are ripe, will be able to find certain arrangements with the SDF commands on how to reintegrate this part of Syria within the Syrian economy. I don't see that as a huge problem from a Damascus perspective.
I wanted to quickly ask a follow-up. So we've heard a little bit about these sort of crony capitalists and these patronage systems and how that's impacting SMEs, and we touched a little bit on how that is it's certainly a complexifier, shall we say, with regard to how humanitarian aid is being administered and the conversation about livelihoods. And I know you've been looking into this, Hyde. Perhaps you could give us your prognosis for whether that is something that can be unhooked from. How would you go about doing business and avoiding those? Is it possible? And what sort of things might need to happen to sort of reduce the influence of those actors who are sort of having this detrimental impact on other people who need sort of services and assistance and aren't able to gather it because of their role?
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, the regime, through different basically mechanisms, has been able to really impose quite strict restrictions on the ability of humanitarian actors to operate in regime-controlled areas. And if we just highlight a few examples, for example, one of the issues is that until now, that the regime is still be able to determine where they can go to distribute aid. That's one issue. The regime is also able to impose who the partners that those international NGOs can work with on the local level, because they have a list of vetted and approved local NGOs that are only allowed to work with those NGOs. Most of the NGOs, international NGOs, cannot basically just go and work with other civil society groups that are not on that list. When it comes to issues related to, for example, tenders and stuff like that, the regime is also imposing some sort of like pressure in order to provide contracts to some of people affiliated with the regime, whether Rami Makhlouf, Through al-Bustan, or other cronies that are mentioned. And you wrote a really extensive article on this 2 or 3 years ago, I don't remember, in The Guardian, where you basically mentioned names and numbers. So that's clear. When it comes to issues related to ability to have access to monitor and assess the needs. So whenever, like usually humanitarians, whenever they have to start like any other business, you have to go and assess the needs in that area in order to basically plan your programs accordingly. Most of them still don't have access. They are denied access to those areas by the regime through different tactics. One of them is that if you will request, for example, a field visit, let's say on March 15th, you will only basically get a response after that date. So that's only one way of saying that we just didn't have time to process your request. And then you will have to apply for another one. And so you use that sort of delay as a way to do that. Others, they're told straightforward that they are not allowed to go and do that. But if they want, they can go to this area and that area and do it. But they will have to do it through the local actors. So as gatekeepers inside Syria, you have SARC, You have Syria Trust, which is basically founded and directed by Asma al-Assad, the wife of Bashar. And then you have technical line ministries. Those are the main ones. So you register, and then you'll have to work with one of those main gatekeepers. And then you can either stay working with them or work with other local actors that are vetted and approved. So many NGOs are basically asked to give money to those actors, and they will take care of it. So you don't have to worry about it. Just give me the money. We know who needs that. We know who the vulnerable people are. We provide them that, and they will just give you a report at the end of it. So you cannot assess the needs. You cannot really monitor the distribution, basically, and you cannot even evaluate the impact of that. So this is why we have many issues with regard to this. To be honest and clear, that UN agencies are the worst. Some INGOs are pushing harder than others in order to basically have better, access to some of the areas, and they are being able to successfully achieve that, and sometimes in others they were not able to do that. But at least those who were able to draw some clear red lines, now they are in a very good position to really decide who that can get that aid, where and when. And maybe they're still not able to work with, decide on who the local partners are, but this is another issue. So when it comes to basically what can be done, I think the first one is the responsibility of the INGOs and UN agencies who are operating there. They have clear responsibility to work collectively in order to push back and say that basically there are clear humanitarian principles that will ensure our impartiality. We have to be neutral, impartial, and we have to basically provide aid to all those who need it. And that should be respected by all actors. Most of them, they are not doing much when it comes to that. So they are not pushing harder, and they are not working collectively because that will increase their power. There is competition between them as well on top of that, and that makes cooperation difficult. And then this is one aspect. The other aspect is that basically responsibility of their donors to also support them and provide them with leverage. And that could be done either by negotiating directly with some of the actors like SARC in Syria, either directly or through some of the NGOs and other entities that are able to contact those actors, or by basically holding those NGOs and INGOs and UN agencies accountable. So for example, when you look at the UK, for example, and the US, those are DFID, and there are some representatives here from DFID. And the US, they are not doing much when it comes to holding the UN in particular accountable. They're investing a lot of money there, and they can do more in order to make that basically make a difference there. But we are not seeing that.
All right. So we jump back to questions. If there's any, we have a lady in the back, middle there.
Hello. Thank you so much. My name is Alma. I'm a PhD student at SOAS in economics. So my question is to Basma, and I want to ask about the gender dimension of poverty. Do you see a different coping mechanism for female-headed households? And do you see a breakdown in gender roles given the necessity, or do you see more restriction for women's mobility? Thank you.
In the front here.
Amr Mohammed, Syrian researcher. I would like actually to talk a little bit more about the situation in the East, because I see the situation there is very critical. First of all, the question is to Sinan, to what extent do you think from the economic aspects and the competition over the resources between Russia and Iran would shape the regime's strategy toward the next stage in the east of Syria after the war against ISIS in there? And also going back to the first point about the sharing the benefits or sharing the income of the economic sources and the kind of model or the understanding that can be reached between the Syrian Democratic Forces or the council and also the Syrian regime, I think it's going to be much more complex than like describing it's not going to be a problem in there, because we have different elements as well. We have the exclusion of the FSA held areas as well is going to be problematic. I mean, by no means actually it's going to be acceptable to constitutionalize any form of understanding or even to legalize it in front of the international community by excluding a significant parts of the country. And also the next chapter in the east of Syria may actually transform into more complicated situation if Turkey keep advocating for direct involvement in there. And also we have other significant actors on the ground. The US is still there, and with the involvement in Turkey, the situation is going to be much more complex. So I disagree on that point, and if we can just expand more on it. Thank you very much. If I can just another point to hide, please.
There's a lot of hands, and we've only got 15 minutes, so I think we'll move on, and you can discuss it in the coffee break if that's all right. So we have a lady in a grey turtleneck here.
Hi, I'm Katie, and I work in corporate intelligence in the city. I just wanted to ask, what do you think, which sectors in the Syrian economy will prove most attractive or accessible to foreign investors in the coming years?
Okay, and we'll take one more. We'll do just behind there.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the excellent panel and also for the research paper, Russia and Iran. It's really good. But I'd like to just ask a question on that in terms of the tolerance to foreign occupation. How long do you believe that Tehran will allow Putin to increase his influence in Syria? And do you believe that Rouhani's government will do what they did in Iraq in terms of the inspiring an insurgency against the Russians?
Great. So we'll jump quickly to the panel. We'll try and keep answers reasonably short and then jump out, try and get 2 more rounds of questions in very quickly in the next sort of 15 minutes. So did you want to take the one that's directed to you, and then we'll work our way along?
Yes, definitely, I agree with you. The situation is much more complex when it comes to the SDF. What I meant that it won't be a point of contestation between the regime and the SDF if it happens to be that the end game for northeastern Syria is just an agreement between both the two of them. So this has been a scenario quite likely for a while when the US took the decision to completely pull out of the region. Now that the US is leaving 400 experts in the region, that means that this round of negotiations is going to be postponed. And it means also indirect US support for the SDF in any form of negotiations with Damascus. But based on a couple of rounds of negotiations that happened in Damascus between Ali Mamlouk and Ilham Ahmad, there have been some negotiations on how to distribute the revenues of oil. Based on the information that we have, it wasn't a point of contestation between them. The major point of contestation was the access of the security apparatus and the regime forces to the border areas as well as the city centers, and what is the role of the SDF in this kind of security restructuring. Keep in mind that Rumelan is maybe is actually the most prolific oil field in Syria. However, there is also a major oil production in southern Deir ez-Zor. And southern Deir ez-Zor, it seems to, in Deir ez-Zor, so in southern SDF territory. And it seems that this area is more or less promised to the regime or to the Iranians. The SDF this is a territory far from the SDF, core constituency. The Deir ez-Zor military council is not the most consolidated one when it comes to, for example, Abu Khawla al-Dairi, I think is the name of the commander. He's not a very, let's say, celebrated locally within the tribes, within the local communities. Actually, he is viewed by many of them that he's a smuggler. He's viewed also as, a mercenary, basically. So the Iranians, at the same time, are doing a lot there. because we see what they've been doing in Deir ez-Zor, in Bou Kamal, also in Mayadeen. They have been approaching some of the local tribes. They have been, for example, approaching some of the Baggara through Nawaf al-Bashir. Baggara is also one of the main human resource pool for the Baqir, famous brigade within the LDF, the local defense forces. Of course, Baggara is a very huge, tribe, so a part of the Baggara is also fighting alongside with the SDF. But what I want to hint at here that Iran is also investing a lot in the region. One of the ways that they are investing in the region, they have been producing and providing animal feeds for quarter the price elsewhere in Syria. Why? Because this is an area where a lot of the livestock is produced, and it's very promising for the locals. So yes, I agree with you. Very complicated, not an easy sell, but I don't see it as the primary concern. I see this as a secondary concern to the security one. I think I will stop there.
Sure. So on the gender roles and the coping mechanisms there, I mean, as we're seeing family-headed households increase in number because of, male members either disappeared or been killed by conflict. The female-headed households have been taking, or the women have been forced to take different roles that they typically wouldn't have adopted previously in Syrian society. So you're seeing a lot of women kind of entering different job markets that they wouldn't have entered previously. I think I was talking to a colleague and she was telling me she came across a group of women that have decided to join a construction site. I think in North Syria. In Idlib, you're seeing women that are having to participate in different occupations. So I think there is a shift that we're seeing, especially also in the neighboring countries among the refugee population. They're confronted with new realities that they have no choice but to kind of adapt to. So whether it's, going out on the streets and trying to find some daily labor, or it's, cleaning homes or what have you. So it's not, I think you're increasingly seeing the women join the workforce, but you're also seeing a shift in the type of work that they are willing and being forced to accept. But that said, there's still obviously the negative coping mechanisms are really clear when it comes to women and the compromises that they're having to do. I mean, sex work is becoming a thing now among refugees, among Syrian IDPs. That's one of the ways that women are forced to that are being pushed to, or I mean, I'm not going to strip them of any agency, but just saying that that's something that women are having to turn to. But you're also seeing girls as well. So it's not just adult women, but it's also girls and them joining the workforce and trying to do whatever small thing they can to contribute to their families. So definitely there, but yeah.
Do you want to come back?
Sure. Let me just disagree with Sinan because it's boring if speakers don't disagree with each other. But I will make it quickly. I don't think that basically that the SDF and the regime will be able to reach any sort of political agreement, especially if each one of them will still basically insist on the conditions they have right now. The SDF wants, and the SDC in general, the Syrian Democratic Council, they want basically to have some sort of local autonomy where they have their armed factions that may be under the umbrella of the army and the regime, but they want to have their own basically ability to run things the way they want. When it comes to security, there's a red line. They don't want state security to operate in that area. Well, this is on the one side. The regime wants everything back, like restoring things to the way it was pre-2011. The only difference is that they might give them basically more cultural rights and other things, but they are not willing to give them more than that. And the gap is huge here, and this is why I don't think that there will be any sort of at least voluntary agreement in the near future if things don't change. When it comes to quickly the cooperation between those two actors, that's happening, but those are transactional, basically, agreements that are beneficial for both of them. So and they are allowing them, for example, to benefit from the regime's expertise, and the regime will have revenues from them. And some of them, those are being done directly, and others are being done through intermediaries. So this is why I think those are two completely different things. When it comes to the Russians and Iranians having direct conflict, I don't think that is a scenario that will be seen in Syria, neither in the near future nor later, despite the differences that the two actors have and different interests they have in Syria. For many reasons, the most important one is that, first of all, despite the differences, they both agree that the regime should, in a way, whether with Assad or without Assad, might be a different issue, but the regime should remain, and the state, the way it is right now, should remain there. So what they have in common is way more than the differences they have, and that disagreements, they're all contained, and they didn't reach any sort of basically level where it's a groundbreaking or deal breaker. And when it comes to, I'll just stop here.
So one more round of questions quickly. There's a lady at the back there. We'll take 4 questions, then very quick answers, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Salma. I'm a member of League of Arab States office in London and also a member of Chatham House. My question to Sinan about the Iran role in post-war reconstruction in Syria. I mean, Iran has already concluded a number of memorandum of understanding and agreement with Damascus, covering a wide range of areas, agriculture one of them, and also Iran, for the first time, has encouraged the Iranian private sector to take a lead in Syria economy. So that's a question about the Iranian role in post-war reconstruction in Syria. Thank you.
Great, thank you. At the front here.
Hi, thank you all. I was just wondering with regards to the involvement of militias in the illicit war economy, and if the regime has any, from your understanding, any intention of pulling them out and reining them in from this illicit economy, and what the implications would be, if this would be a challenge, if this would cause more conflict, and how would that roll out, basically. Thank you.
I'm Ibrahim Alabi from the Syrian Legal Development Program, Human Rights and Business Unit. Hyde, my question goes to you. We've been monitoring, we're engaging with businesses and states and trying to see what can be done to provide rewarding businessmen who have been complicit in war crimes. And we've seen the charitable sector with the highest purchasing power in Syria contributing to that through the procurement and tendering activities that you mentioned. So could it be concluded that without careful due diligence of who you're working with, you may be assisting X amount of people in one place, but contributing to the war economy and harming far more people in another place? So it's not a binary situation.
And one last question. Everyone's going to be around all day, so if you have additional questions, you're just in front of Ibrahim, able to bring them up with speakers at lunch or over coffee as well.
Hi, good morning. Riaz Nathu with the Aga Khan Foundation based in Syria. A question building off my colleague's question, and it's around property rights. A lot of the discussion around law number 10, and the question is essentially, how does the panel view the conversion of property and land in particular, and its connection to social re-engineering, essentially, and the bleeding of that war economy into the structured formal economy, primarily through real estate, and the long-term implications of that? Thank you.
Great. So if we start with you, we'll need to keep these reasonably short. Then.
Yeah, so when it comes to the Iranian expansion and also economic expansion, so we've seen 2 areas where, or 3 areas, let's say, where Iranians have invested the most. So we have in Aleppo, in eastern Aleppo, where and southern Aleppo, where the LDF is located and originated from. We've seen some investment in or some assistance to their militias in service provision. So they have restored a number of schools. They have also built a number of medical points. And all of this is part of winning the hearts and minds of the locals. Whether they're successful or not, there have been some investment witnessed here. In Eastern Syria, we also seen, I've went through it in previous answers, they've also seen some investment there. In Damascus in particular, we've seen some investment in Sid Zainab. We've seen some interest around Sid Ruqayya shrine in Daraya, but even though it hasn't really picked up because we've seen some actually Russian pushing back there. And we've seen some also property acquisition in Damascus Old City, especially around Shari al-Amin, which is historically a Jewish / Ja'fari neighborhood in the city, and also around the Umayyad Mosque. But when we look, so a lot of activities, but in terms of volume, it's not very big. It's not huge. It's not enough for Iran to have a huge sway over the Syrian economy. And I think if Iran exercise really pressure when it comes to economy, it's through trade mainly, and trade when it comes to oil refined products, and this what. We've seen in 2015, for example, where they've seen that there was a little bit from resistance from Damascus going a little bit more towards the Russians. The Iranians pulled out some of their oil shipments to Syria. And this caused a huge, sharp decline of fuel and gases in the market. Now there's also a huge decline, not because of the Iranian exerting pressure on the regime, but because of the OFAC memorandum that has been published or distributed in November 2018, in which there have been a direct threat of sanctioning any transportation, insurance, all kind of companies that ship oils to Damascus, to Syria, either from Russia, Iran, or anywhere else in the world. So this is where Iran is most effective, is through trade, not through investment in the Syrian economy.
Just briefly touching upon the Law 10 question, I think housing, land, and property issues is going to be a potential new eruption of conflict in Syria, just because a lot of Syrians have lost or have had their property deeds confiscated or completely disregarded. There's also a whole issue of land not being registered and just kind of handed down. To bring in a gender element to that, a lot of women that have had their husbands kind of disappear and don't have any death certificate or don't know where they are going to face immense challenges trying to claim that this land is actually theirs and to go through the inheritance laws. So definitely an issue that needs to be focused on. And the Norwegian Refugee Council has been doing a lot of work on that, and we've recently published a report on that, so if anyone's interested, let me know. But it's also something that, going back to what Had was saying about NGOs and collective work, I mean, when Law 10 was first issued, NGOs came together and did push back around the registration period. Granted, I know that's not the biggest thing and the most pressing issue, but it was a significant issue for the refugee populations, and just trying to extend the registration period, and where you have NGOs like the Norwegian Refugee Council assisting refugees in the process of claiming back property deeds and providing them with information and legal assistance on how to reobtain these civil documentations that were lost. I think those are efforts that really need to be built up and really need to be expanded to try to address and push back against policies like this.
Quickly on that, I think it's really important to discuss law number 10 and highlight the implication of that, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that this is only one tool and one mechanism that is being used in order to re-engineer basically social fabric inside Syria. There are many laws that are, I cannot go through them now, but there are laws that are being basically issued directly and they don't receive much attention. On top of that, there's basically that selective way of allowing who can from refugees can go back to the country and not through the security clearance. When it comes to issues that not allowing many people, whether IDPs or refugees, to go back to their areas of origin, like in Daraya, Qusayr, and many other areas. So there are many tools and mechanisms that are being used in order to re-engineer the social fabric and Syrian society, and I think we should keep an eye on all of them. When it comes to the issue that Ibrahim mentioned, that it's definitely doing no harm is one important principle as well when it comes to humanitarian assistance. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of harm that is being done. But I think, to be fair, we have to admit a few things. The first one, quickly, just in 1 second, 1 minute maybe. One thing is that INGOs, they're under a lot of pressure in there, and they're scared that whatever they do, they might be expelled out of the country. So this is something we have to acknowledge and admit. That doesn't mean that they allow the regime to control everything, because that's the other extreme. That on top of that, there is basically the reality that the regime has been trying to formalize most of the restrictions that are imposed on those actors. So in June, for example, 2018, SARC tried to renegotiate the MOUs it had with many of the local international NGOs in Damascus. And luckily enough, they were able, those Damascus-based NGOs, INGOs, were able to push back. So there is room for maneuver, but what we are not seeing is pressure on those international actors to push back, and we are not seeing also is support to those actors. So we are blaming them like 100%, which is not fair. What other issue is, and I swear I will end with this, is that many donors have basically terminated all their funds to former rebel-controlled areas, but also to current rebel areas like Idlib and Daraa and others. I understand from the donor's perspective is that if things don't change, that means that basically they're funding Assad in a way or another. But at the same time, so there should be more funds going to those areas from the donor's perspective. On the other hand, that should be basically conditioned on the ability of INGOs and humanitarian actors today, the way humanitarian aid is being basically delivered there, in order to ensure that they are accountable. I will end with this.
We were going to end with the recommendations or predictions, but I think we are out of time and your coffee is getting cold. So over coffee, please feel free to ask the panelists for their predictions or recommendations on anything that we have talked about. Thank you very much for joining us. Do read Sanin's report, and I can personally vouch for the documentary that Lena was talking about earlier. I've seen the footage. It's very good. You should check it out. Thank you so much to the panelists and to Chatham House.